Today we're going to learn about some different types of angles. We're going to learn some vocabulary and a couple of different rules about types of angle. So I'm going to start off with some vocab. Let's start off with a word that you've probably seen before. Supplements, or to say angles are supplementary, means if you have two angles where if you add them up, they add up to 180 degrees. That's supplements. Now, complements is the same concept but with 90 degrees. So make sure you remember them and make sure you remember the difference between the two. If I say supplements, I'm talking about two angles that add to 180. And if I say complements, they add up to 90. Now here's a third vocab word for you. Adjacent. We're going to see adjacent throughout the notes and the assignments. Now the word adjacent means to be next to or connected to something. So adjacent angles would look kind of like this. Like if I drew an angle, and then instead of drawing a whole nother angle, I just drew another one connected to it. So those two angles right there are what we call adjacent. They're stuck together. All right, so our first vocab term that comes with a rule that I'm going to teach you in a minute is vertical angles. Now vertical angles are two angles that are formed by crossing lines that are opposite from each other. So basically, if I draw an X, it's any two angles that are opposite each other. So let me do that. I'm going to draw a big X here. Then the two angles that are opposite, not the ones that are connected, we just talked about adjacent, the ones that are not adjacent, the ones that are opposite from each other. So for example, this angle here and this angle here, the ones that I drew the little red marks on. Those are called vertical angles because they're opposite from each other. But the top and bottom, the ones that I didn't mark, are also vertical angles. So let me do purple and do two markers for this. 1, 2, 1, 2. So the two that I marked in purple are what we call vertical angles, and so are the two that I marked in red. So basically, anytime you have that picture where you have two lines crossing that make an X like that, the angles that are opposite from each other are called vertical angles. Now, before I tell you the rule about vertical angles, I'm going to do one more vocab word. The word is congruent. And congruent is two shapes that are exactly the same. So basically, here's a good way for you guys to think of it. Congruent means equal. Congruent and equal are kind of the same thing. But when you say equal, you're usually talking about numbers, like x equals 5. If I'm talking about two triangles being the same, instead of saying they're equal, I say they're congruent. Now the congruent symbol is very similar to the equal sign. In fact, it has an equal sign in it, but there's that extra little squiggle over the top. So this symbol right here, an equal sign with an extra little squiggle over it, is congruent to. So we're going to use that for our rule. Here's our rule about vertical angles. It's called the vertical angle theorem, but you don't really need to know it by name, as long as you know the concept. So first of all, let's notice that in the picture, angle 1 and angle 3 are vertical angles. So let's say I'll mark them like I did before. Here's angle 1, and here's angle 3. I numbered them for the picture to make it easy to talk about. Now, angle 2 and angle 4 are also vertical angles. It's the same picture I just drew for you. But here's the theorem. This is what we call the vertical angle theorem. All vertical angles are congruent. And remember, congruent means equal. So vertical angles are equal, which means in this picture, number 1, angle 1 is congruent to angle 3, and that's what that equation says. So the little angle symbol means angle, and that equal sign with a squiggle over it means congruent. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. And also angle 2 is congruent to angle 4 because they're vertical angles too. So it makes it real easy. I could turn this into a problem where I say something like, if angle 1 is 40 degrees, what's angle 3? Well, it's also 40 degrees. They're equal. They're congruent. Or over here, maybe angle 2 is 140 degrees. That's a big one. So is angle 4. They're equal. So those opposite angles, remember the name for it, the vocab term is vertical angles, and the opposite angles when two lines cross are always equal. That's our first rule for today. Okay. So our next one is called a linear pair. And the definition of linear pair, you can see it on the screen right now. It says it's two angles that are both adjacent and supplementary. Those were two of our first three vocab words for today. So adjacent means two angles that are stuck together, and supplementary means they add up to 180 degrees. Now what happens when you put those two things together is you get a straight line that's split into two angles. So here's what a linear pair would look like. If I draw any straight line, there's my straight line, and I pick a point on it, and I split it into another angle like that. That's a linear pair. That's one line split into two, and that's where the name comes from. Linear means line, pair means two. So when you say a linear pair, you say I'm taking a straight line and I'm splitting it into a pair of angles, or two angles. Now, they are adjacent, they're stuck together. They are supplementary, they add up to 180 degrees. And basically that's our rule for linear pair. It kind of went over my picture, but that's the rule. Linear pairs are supplements. They always add up to 180 degrees. That's our rule for linear pairs. And the name for that, although like I said, you don't really need to know the name for that is the linear pair postulate. What you need to do is just remember that linear pairs add up to 180. So in the picture from before, this is the same picture we had where we talked about vertical angles. I said angles 1 and 2 form a linear pair. Angles 1 and 2. That would be like if you took your hand and you blocked off the bottom corner of this, you blocked off angle 4 and angle 3. It looks just like the picture I just drew. You have that one line going down the middle, and then it's being split into two angles. Now, there are actually three other sets of linear pairs in this picture. Angle 2 and angle 3 make a linear pair. Angle 3 and angle 4 make a linear pair. And then on the bottom, angles 1 and 4 also make a linear pair. So basically, in this picture, any two angles that are next to each other make a linear pair. And again, I can very easily turn this into a problem. In fact, this is how I did the last example. Remember, in the last example, I said, if angle 1 is 40 degrees, then so is angle 3. And then later in the question, I said, well, now we'll say angle 2 is 140. It actually is, because angle 1 and angle 2 have to add up to 180. And if you do 180 minus 40, you get 140 degrees. So that's why I chose 140 for angle 2, because I knew, even though I hadn't told you yet, I knew ahead of time that those two angles had to add up to 180. So those are our two main vocab words. We have a lot of vocabulary for today, and in the worksheet you're going to be asked to do the types of things that we've just done. Things like just naming them. Is this a linear pair? Is it are they vertical angles? Are they supplementary? Are they complementary? Things like that. And then I'm going to give you some questions like I drew in, where I give you a number. I say, if this angle is 35 degrees, how much is that angle? And you have to know the rules to be able to answer those questions. Just to finish this up, in the picture, angle 1 plus angle 2 equals 180. That's how I knew the second angle was 140, by subtracting. And then angles 3 and 4 are the same, and sort of all the other linear pairs I gave you.